She was building her cabin one log at a time, unaware the cowboy watching was a widower longing for a family. The morning sun cast long golden shadows across the meadow as 27-year-old Grace Mitchell carefully positioned another log against the frame of what would soon become her cabin. Her auburn hair caught the light as she worked, the long waves pulled back in a practical braid that had come slightly undone during her morning's labor. Grace had been at this for 3 weeks now, building her dream one log at a time. Each piece of timber represented months of planning, saving, and hoping for a future that belonged entirely to her. After years of working as a seamstress in the crowded boarding houses of Denver, she had finally saved enough to claim her own piece of land in the Colorado Territory. The homestead law had given her this opportunity: 160 acres of rolling meadow bordered by pine forests and blessed with a clear running creek. All she had to do was build a dwelling and prove she could make the land productive. It seemed simple enough in theory, but the reality of constructing a home with her own 2 hands was proving more challenging than she'd anticipated. Grace paused in her work, wiping perspiration from her brow with the back of her hand. The white cotton blouse she wore was practical and comfortable, paired with a brown woolen skirt that allowed her to move freely as she worked. Her clothes were simple but well made, the mark of someone who understood the value of quality materials and careful craftsmanship. What Grace didn't know was that she had been watched each morning for the past week by 41-year-old Thomas Brennan, who rode the boundary of his neighboring ranch as part of his daily routine. Thomas sat astride his chestnut mare on a small rise about a quarter-mile away, his weathered cowboy hat shading eyes that had seen too much sorrow for a man his age. Thomas had the look of someone who spent his life outdoors, skin bronzed by sun and wind, strong shoulders that spoke of years of hard work, and hands that were gentle with horses and capable with tools. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his face carried the kind of lines that came from squinting into distant horizons and weathering life's storms with quiet dignity. He'd been a widower for 4 years now, ever since pneumonia had taken his wife Margaret and their infant son during one terrible winter. The ranch that had once felt like a symbol of their shared dreams now seemed too large, too quiet, too full of memories that both comforted and haunted him. From his vantage point, Thomas could see that the young woman was struggling with the heavier logs. She would position one end, then walk around to lift the other, her movements showing determination, but also the fatigue of someone working beyond her physical limits. Something about her persistence reminded him of Margaret, the way she'd insisted on helping with tasks that others deemed too difficult for a woman. Thomas found himself looking forward to these morning observations, though he was careful to stay far enough away that she wouldn't notice him. There was something hopeful about watching someone build their future from the ground up, something that stirred feelings in him that he thought were buried with his family. On this particular morning, Thomas watched as Grace attempted to lift a particularly large log into place. She managed to get one end positioned correctly, but as she moved to the other end, the log shifted and rolled back down, nearly striking her foot. Even from a distance, Thomas could see her frustration as she stood with her hands on her hips, studying the problem. Thomas had seen enough. He nudged his horse forward, covering the distance between them at an easy lope. As he approached, Grace looked up, shading her eyes with her hand. Thomas could see the wariness in her posture. A woman alone in the wilderness had every right to be cautious of strange men. "Morning, miss," Thomas called out, removing his hat as he dismounted. "Name's Thomas Brennan. I own the ranch that borders your property to the east." The Grace relaxed slightly at his respectful manner and the fact that he'd identified himself as a neighbor rather than a stranger. "Good morning, Mr. Brennan. I'm Grace Mitchell. I hope you don't mind my saying so, Miss Mitchell, but that's quite an undertaking you've got there." Thomas gestured toward the cabin frame. Building alone is ambitious work. The Grace lifted her chin with a pride that Thomas found both admirable and familiar. "I'm perfectly capable of managing on my own, thank you." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in weeks. "I'm sure you are. But I was wondering, would you consider accepting some help? Not charity," he added quickly, seeing her stiffen. "A neighborly exchange. I help you with the heavy lifting, and perhaps you could spare some of that fine cooking I can smell from here." And Grace glanced toward the small cook fire where she'd prepared her simple breakfast. The truth was, She could use the help, though her independence was hard-won and precious to her. She studied Thomas's face, noting the sincerity in his brown eyes and the patient way he waited for her answer. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she said finally. "But I pay my own way, Mr. Brennan. If you help with the cabin, I'll provide meals while you're working. Nothing more than a fair trade." Thomas nodded sullenly, understanding that her dignity was as important to preserve as the help was to provide. "That seems more than fair, Miss Mitchell." And so began a partnership that neither of them had expected. Thomas would arrive each morning after completing his own ranch duties, and together they would work on the cabin until the afternoon sun grew too hot for heavy labor. Grace proved to be not only determined, but surprisingly skilled with tools, while Thomas brought the experience and strength needed for the more challenging aspects of construction. During their first week working together, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Thomas would position the heavy logs while Grace secured them with careful precision. She had an eye for detail that impressed him, and a way of thinking through problems that spoke of an intelligent and practical mind. "You've done this before," Thomas observed one morning as he watched Grace measure and mark lumber for cutting. Grace smiled, the first truly relaxed smile he'd seen from her. "My father was a carpenter before he passed. He taught me that measure twice. Cut once wasn't just advice for woodworking, it was a philosophy for life." Thomas found himself treasuring these glimpses into Grace's past, the way she spoke of her father with love and respect, the careful way she handled tools as if they were precious instruments rather than mere implements. There was something about her presence that made his days feel less empty, though he was careful not to examine that feeling too closely. During their midday breaks, they would sit in the shade of the pine trees that bordered Grace's property, sharing the simple but delicious meals she prepared. Grace had a gift for making even basic ingredients taste wonderful, and Thomas found himself looking forward to these quiet interludes almost as much as the work itself. "Tell me about your ranch," Grace said one afternoon as they rested beside the creek that ran through her property. Thomas was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "It's been in my family for 15 years. Started small and built it up over time. Raised cattle mostly, some horses. It's good land, but..." He trailed off, and Grace sensed there was more to the story. "But it was supposed to be a family place," Thomas said quietly. "My wife Margaret and we had plans. She wanted children running through the house, maybe a garden where she could grow flowers and vegetables. We had one son, lived just 3 days. Margaret never recovered from the birth, and then the pneumonia took them both that winter." Grace felt her heart contract with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Thomas. That must have been terribly difficult." Thomas nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to share this pain with her. 4 years now, and sometimes I still expect to see her in the kitchen when I come in from the fields. The house feels too big, too quiet. I keep thinking I should sell it, move somewhere smaller, but it holds your memories." Grace finished gently, "The good ones along with the sad ones." "Yes," Thomas said, grateful that she understood. "Exactly that." Grace was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow over the smooth stones in the creek bed. "My mother used to say that love doesn't die when people do. It just changes shape, becomes something we carry forward instead of something we share in the moment." Thomas studied her profile as she spoke, noting the gentle wisdom in her words. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. Lost her when I was 19, and my father followed 2 years later. I've been on my own since then, working and saving for this chance to build something that belongs to me." Grace gestured toward the cabin, its frame now clearly taking the shape of a proper dwelling. "I suppose we all have our reasons for needing a fresh start." As the days passed, Thomas found himself thinking about Grace's words. There was something healing about their work together, the way they could labor side by side in comfortable silence or engage in conversations that ranged from practical matters to deeper questions about life and purpose. Grace, for her part, discovered that having Thomas's help meant more than just getting the cabin built more quickly. His presence brought a sense of security to her solitary life, and his quiet humor often made her laugh in ways she hadn't in years. She began to look forward to the sound of his horse's hooves each morning, the way he always removed his hat and wished her good morning with genuine warmth. "You know," Thomas said one evening as they surveyed their progress, "this cabin is going to be something special. You can see the care that's going into every board, Every joint. Grace smiled, pride evident in her expression. It's going to be my home. The first place that's ever belonged completely to me. I want it to be worthy of that. Thomas nodded, understanding more than she realized. A home should reflect the person who lives in it. This one will be strong and beautiful and built to last. Just like its owner. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment, and she busied herself gathering tools to hide her reaction. Thomas had been nothing but respectful and professional, but lately she'd caught herself noticing things about him. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he spoke to his horse, the strength in his hands when he worked. The cabin was nearing completion when the first real test of their partnership came. A late summer storm rolled through the valley, bringing driving rain and wind that threatened to damage their work. Grace watched anxiously from the small tent, where she'd been living as the storm battered the partially roofed structure. Thomas arrived just after dawn, riding through the muddy aftermath to check on both Grace and the cabin. He found her standing in ankle-deep water where her tent had been, most of her possessions soaked, and her face showing the strain of a sleepless night. "Grace," he said, dismounting quickly and wading toward her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but Thomas could see she was fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion. "The tent couldn't handle the wind. Most of my things are ruined, and I'm not sure about the cabin roof." Thomas looked toward the structure and felt relief wash over him. "The cabin's fine. We built her strong, and she weathered her first storm just like she should, but you can't stay out here like this." Grace lifted her chin with familiar stubbornness. "I'll manage. I can rig a temporary shelter until—" "Grace," Thomas interrupted gently, "come stay at the ranch, just until you can get properly set up here. There's plenty of room, and it's the practical thing to do." Grace hesitated, torn between pride and pragmatism. The idea of staying in Thomas's home felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she was ready to cross, but the reality of her situation left few alternatives. "I wouldn't want to impose," she said finally. "You wouldn't be imposing. You'd be accepting help from a friend." Thomas's voice was warm but matter of fact. "Besides, you can still come work on the cabin every day. This is just about having a dry place to sleep and a proper kitchen to cook in." The next few days at Thomas's ranch opened Grace's eyes to the life he'd built and lost. The house was larger than she'd expected, well built and comfortable, but she could see the feminine touches that had been left untouched since Margaret's death. Curtains hung at the windows, still beautiful but faded from years of sun. A rocking chair sat on the front porch, positioned to catch the evening breeze. The kitchen held evidence of meals prepared for more than one person, a large table, extra dishes, a bread box sized for a family's needs. Thomas had offered Grace the guest room, a comfortable space with a window that looked out toward her property. He was the perfect host, respectful, helpful, but careful to give her space and privacy. Still, Grace couldn't help but notice the loneliness that seemed to permeate the house. The way Thomas moved through rooms, as if he were a guest in his own home. "This is a beautiful house," Grace said one evening as they sat on the front porch after dinner. Margaret had wonderful taste. Thomas smiled, the expression both happy and sad. She did. She could see potential in everything. "This land, that old house that was here when we bought the place, even me." Grace studied his profile in the fading light. "You speak as if she transformed you." "In many ways she did. I was pretty rough around the edges when we met. Thought I knew everything about life and ranching. Margaret taught me that building a life was about more than just accumulating land and livestock. It was about creating something worth passing on, something that would matter beyond just yourself." Grace felt something shift in her chest as she listened to Thomas speak. The love in his voice when he talked about his wife was beautiful, but it also made Grace realize something she'd been trying not to acknowledge. She was falling in love with this kind, gentle man who still carried his grief like a sacred trust. "She sounds like she was very special," Grace said quietly. "She was. But she's been gone 4 years now, and I'm beginning to understand that honoring her memory doesn't mean stopping my own life." Thomas turned to look at Grace directly. "She would have liked you, I think. She always admired women who weren't afraid to build their own dreams." The cabin was completed on a crisp September morning that painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Grace stood back and surveyed their work with a mixture of pride and wonder. What had started as a dream sketched on paper had become a solid, beautiful reality. The logs fit together with precision, the roof was sound and well sealed, and the windows Thomas had helped her install caught the morning light perfectly. "It's finished," she said, almost unable to believe it. Thomas nodded, sharing her sense of accomplishment. "It's a fine home, Grace. You should be proud." But as Grace looked at the cabin, she felt an unexpected emptiness. For months, this project had given her days structure and purpose. More than that, it had given her an excuse to spend time with Thomas, to build something meaningful alongside someone she'd come to care for deeply. "I suppose this means we won't be working together anymore," she said, trying to keep her voice light. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when Grace looked at him, she saw something in his expression that made her heart race. "Grace," he said slowly, "I need to tell you something. These past months, working with you, getting to know you, it's changed something in me. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone again." Grace felt her breath catch. "Thomas, I know it might seem too soon or inappropriate, given that you've been staying at my house, but I can't let you move into that cabin without knowing how I feel about you." Thomas took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I love you, Grace. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you tackle every challenge like it's just another problem to solve. I love the way you make even the simplest meal taste like a feast, and the way you listen when I talk about Margaret without judgment or jealousy." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "I love you too, Thomas. I've been trying not to, telling myself it was just gratitude or loneliness. But the truth is, these months with you have been the happiest of my life. Not just because of the cabin, but because of the partnership we've built. The way we work together, support each other, make each other laugh." Thomas reached for her hands, holding them gently in his calloused ones. "Margaret used to say that love wasn't about replacing what you'd lost, but about being open to what you might find. I think she'd understand that loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for her." Grace nodded, understanding the complexity of his situation. "I would never want to compete with her memory, Thomas. She'll always be part of who you are, and I respect that." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his whole face. "That's one of the reasons I love you so much. You have room in your heart for all kinds of love, including the kind that honors the past while embracing the future." They stood there for a moment, hands joined, looking at the cabin Grace had built and the future they might build together. "So what happens now?" Grace asked. Thomas chuckled. "Well, I suppose that depends. You've got a fine cabin here, and I've got a big house that's been too empty for too long. We could keep living separately, courting properly like respectable people. Or," Grace prompted, a smile tugging at her lips, "or you could marry me and we could figure out how to make both places feel like home. Maybe spend summers here where it's cooler, winters at the ranch where it's more sheltered. Maybe fill that big house with the family it was meant to hold." Grace felt her heart swell with possibility. "Are you proposing to me, Thomas Brennan?" Thomas dropped to one knee right there in the dirt in front of the cabin they'd built together. "Grace Mitchell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you help me turn a ranch into a home, and show me how to build a future worth living?" "Yes," Grace said without hesitation, pulling him to his feet so she could wrap her arms around his neck. "Yes, absolutely yes." Thomas kissed her then, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and strong, witnessing the beginning of a love story built on mutual respect, shared work, and the kind of deep affection that grows slowly and lasts forever. They were married in the small church in town 6 weeks later, with Grace wearing a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Thomas had brought back from his last trip to Denver. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by neighbors who had watched their courtship unfold with approval and affection. As they stood at the altar exchanging vows, Grace thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd come to the territory to build a cabin and claim her independence, never imagining she'd also find a partner who valued her strength and shared her dreams. "You may kiss the bride," the minister said, and Thomas did, tenderly and with a joy that made Grace's heart sing. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung between the trees. As the evening progressed and their guests danced to the music of a local fiddle player, Grace and Thomas stole a few moments alone on the front porch. "Happy?" Thomas asked, settling beside her on the porch swing he'd repaired in preparation for their wedding. Beyond words, Grace replied, leaning against his shoulder. I keep thinking about that first morning when you rode up while I was struggling with those logs. Did you know then? Thomas smiled, remembering. I knew you were someone special. There was something about the way you approached that impossible task. Like you refused to accept that it couldn't be done. It reminded me that some of the best things in life require patience and persistence. Grace turned to look at him, her hand resting over his heart. Like love. Thomas agreed, covering her hand with his own. The kind that grows slowly and builds strong, like a cabin constructed one log at a time. The years later, when their children played in the yard between the ranch house and the cabin Grace had built, she would often think about that conversation. Their love had indeed grown slowly and built strong, weathering the challenges that came with blending two independent lives into one shared journey. The cabin became their summer retreat, a place where they could escape the heat and remember the early days of their courtship. Grace would sit on the porch Thomas had added, watching their children explore the creek, where she and Thomas had shared so many conversations, and marvel at how much her life had changed from that first day. She tried to lift those logs alone. Thomas kept his word about honoring Margaret's memory while building a new future. Her photograph remained on the mantel, and he would tell their children stories about the aunt they'd never met, but who had helped shape the man their father became. Grace encouraged these conversations, understanding that love's capacity to expand rather than replace was one of the foundations of their strong marriage. Mama, their eldest daughter, asked one summer evening as they sat together on the cabin porch, how did you know Daddy was the right person to marry? Grace smiled, watching Thomas as he helped their youngest son build a dam in the creek. Well, sweetheart, I suppose it was the way he saw me building this cabin and didn't try to take over or tell me I couldn't do it. Instead, he asked how he could help me achieve my dream. That told me he was the kind of man who would be a true partner. Her daughter nodded solemnly, storing away this piece of wisdom for her own future. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Grace reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. She'd set out to build a cabin and found herself building a family. She'd sought independence and discovered that the right kind of partnership actually made her stronger, not weaker. Thomas appeared beside her, settling into the chair he'd crafted to match the one she'd built for herself. Penny, for your thoughts, he said, reaching for her hand. Grace smiled, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Just thinking about how grateful I am that you happened to be riding by that morning when I was struggling with those logs. Thomas chuckled. Happened to be. Grace, I'd been riding by every morning for a week, working up the courage to approach you. The Grace turned to stare at him in surprise. You never told me that. Some stories improve with age, Thomas said with a grin. The truth is, I was enchanted by your determination from the very first day I saw you working on this place. You looked like someone who knew exactly what she wanted, and wasn't going to let anything stop her from getting it. Grace laughed, delighted by this revelation. So you were watching me struggle and didn't offer to help. I was respecting your independence until it became clear you might actually hurt yourself with that particular log. Then neighborly concern overrode romantic hesitation. Grace shook her head in amazement. All this time, I thought our meeting was pure chance. The best things in life rarely are, Thomas said, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. They're the result of paying attention, taking chances, and being willing to build something beautiful one small step at a time. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Grace thought about the truth in his words. Their love story hadn't been a dramatic whirlwind romance, but rather a steady, purposeful construction project, built with the same care and attention to detail that had gone into the cabin. She'd started with a dream of independence and discovered that the deepest fulfillment came not from standing alone, but from choosing the right person to stand beside. The cabin remained a symbol of her capability and strength, but the life she and Thomas had built together represented something even more precious. The knowledge that love, like craftsmanship, required patience, skill, and the wisdom to appreciate both the individual pieces and the beautiful whole they created together. The mountain air carried the scent of pine, and the sound of the creek flowing over stones worn smooth by time. Grace closed her eyes and listened to the peaceful sounds of home. children's laughter echoing from the house, the gentle creak of the porch swing, the steady rhythm of Thomas's breathing beside her. This was what happiness looked like, she realized. Not the desperate, grasping kind that feared loss, but the deep, quiet contentment that came from building something meaningful with someone who understood that the best foundations were laid with equal parts independence and interdependence, strength and tenderness, dreams and practical love. She'd built her cabin one log at a time, never knowing that a widower watching from the distance was building dreams of his own, hoping for a second chance at the kind of love that makes a house into a home and two separate lives into one shared journey toward the future.